In this lesson, we're going to address the foundational question, what exactly is GPT? We'll define what GPT stands for, explore how it was developed, walk through what it does under the hood, and break down real-world uses and challenges. By the end of this session, you'll have a strong understanding of where GPT came from, what it does best, where it struggles, and how its different versions compare. Let's begin with the basics. GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. It's a type of artificial intelligence model that understands and generates human language. Essentially, when you interact with GPT, whether you're asking a question, writing an essay, or summarizing a report, it's trying to predict the next most likely word based on the words you've already given it. That might sound simple, but it's very powerful. Behind that word prediction is a complex architecture trained on enormous amounts of text. It's called a transformer because that's the name of the neural network structure it uses. That structure allows it to weigh and prioritize different parts of what you write, essentially paying attention to different parts of your input to produce its responses. Now, those words, generative and pre-trained, are also important. Generative means it doesn't just classify or sort things, it produces novel content. Pre-trained means that before you even start using it, it has already read massive amounts of text and learned patterns in human language based on that reading. That's how it knows how to form coherent sentences, organize paragraphs, and even mimic certain tones or writing styles. Imagine it like this. GPT has read most of the internet: Wikipedia articles, books, blogs, news stories, and more. It hasn't memorized them word for word, but it has internalized patterns, how sentences are structured, how ideas are expressed, and even common facts. So when you give it an input like, write a professional email to a client thanking them for a meeting, it draws on that stored knowledge to write a polite, business-appropriate email almost instantly. That's what GPT is at a high level, a very sophisticated language engine trained on a massive body of text. But how did we get here? To understand that, let's look at the history of GPT's development. GPT's story starts in 2018 with the release of GPT-1 by OpenAI. This first version was a proof of concept. It wasn't particularly powerful, but it introduced the core idea that you could pre-train a model on large volumes of text and then fine-tune it to do useful tasks with human-level language. The real buzz began in 2019 with GPT-2. This version was a major leap forward. It could generate much more coherent and surprising outputs. In fact, it was initially considered too powerful to release to the public out of concern that it could be misused, for example, to generate fake news or spam at scale. But eventually, it was released, and developers began using it in everything from chatbots to creative writing tools. Then came GPT-3 in 2020. This was the real game changer. With 175 billion parameters, which are kind of like settings in the model, it could handle much more complex and nuanced tasks. Think translation from one language to another, summarizing long text accurately, or engaging in something close to real conversation. This version supports both few-shot and zero-shot learning, which we'll talk more about shortly. Here's a good example of what GPT-3 can do. Imagine you're running customer support for an online store. You want a virtual assistant to respond to customer questions. Instead of coding every possible question and answer, you simply give GPT a few examples, and it figures out the format, the tone, and the logic. Ask it about shipping times or return policies, and it responds in a friendly, accurate way. That's what we mean when we say GPT is powerful. Now that we've looked at the history, let's talk a bit more about how GPT actually works. At the core of GPT is something called predictive modeling. Think of it like this. Every time you type a word into GPT, it considers the words that came before and tries to guess what comes next. It does this over and over, one word at a time, at lightning speed until it finishes a sentence or paragraph or however much you asked for. Let me give you a simple analogy. Imagine you're playing a game of finish the sentence. If I say, the cat climbed up the, you might guess, tree. And you're basing your guess not just on the words themselves, but on what you know about cats, trees, and typical English grammar. GPT does something very similar, but using math and patterns it learned during training instead of life experience. Now, this process makes GPT incredibly flexible. It doesn't have preset lists of answers. It generates brand new responses every time, based on your input. That's what makes it useful for writing essays, generating code, answering questions, composing poems, you name it. But of course, GPT has limitations. One major limitation is something called hallucination. No, not in the science fiction sense. In AI, hallucination means that the model might generate information that sounds plausible, but is actually false or made up. For example, if you ask GPT for the population of a small town, it might give you a number that seems right but isn't verified. That's because GPT doesn't browse the internet in real time. It generates what it thinks is likely based on its training. Of course, this is not unique to AI, since humans also say things that are inaccurate. Humans can have faulty memory or even lie to embellish a story. So, when you work with AI, you should have a healthy skepticism, like when you hear something from another human. Another limitation is sensitivity to how you phrase questions. The same question asked in two different ways can yield two very different answers. That can be frustrating for users who expect consistency. And because GPT was trained on human-written text, it can sometimes reflect the biases or stereotypes present in that material. So as powerful as GPT is, using it responsibly means staying aware of these potential pitfalls. Let's dig into a concrete example. Suppose you ask GPT to tell me about the health benefits of apple cider vinegar. It might give you a confident-sounding list including weight loss, gut health, and lower cholesterol. But here's the catch. It doesn't know if those claims are medically accurate. It's not a doctor. It's a language model. It's repeating patterns it has seen in its training data. So while it might sound convincing, it's always a good idea to double-check with real sources. Now that we've understood how GPT works and where it might fall short, let's take a moment to step through the key differences between its various versions. We started with GPT-1, which introduced the basic idea and had about 117 million parameters. It wasn't all that useful for public applications, but it laid the groundwork. GPT-2 scaled things up to 1.5 billion parameters. It could write longer passages, hold more context in memory, and its outputs began to show signs of real creativity and fluidity. This is the point at which many people started noticing the potential of GPT in real tasks like summarizing articles or generating marketing copy. Then came GPT-3, and that was the leap to 175 billion parameters. To put it simply, this model could do more with less input. That's where we get the terms few-shot and zero-shot learning. Few-shot learning means you give GPT a couple of examples, and it figures out how to do the task by analogy. Zero-shot means you don't even provide examples. It tries to infer the task just from your instructions. Let's unpack that with a simple scenario. You want GPT to translate a sentence into French. In few-shot mode, you might provide a few sample translations, something like English, good morning, French, bonjour. Do that a couple times, then give it a new phrase, and it does the same. In zero-shot mode, you just say, translate this sentence into French, and it figures out the rest. That ability to generalize with minimal examples opens huge doors for automation, personal productivity, and creativity. You can ask GPT to write a business plan, debug software, script a podcast, or explain economic theory in simple language, all without being a programmer or an expert. Now, as the versions of GPT have improved, so have the safeguards built into them. OpenAI has worked on adding filters, moderation tools, and warning prompts to discourage harmful or misleading outputs. But as with any tool, the responsibility for ethical use also falls partly on the user. This brings us to an important point. GPT is a tool, not a truth machine. It's incredibly useful, but it still requires human oversight, especially when the stakes are high. Whether you're using it to write a college essay or answer a medical question, it's best used as an assistant rather than an authority. Let's do a quick recap of what we've covered today. First, we defined GPT. It stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer, and it's an advanced language model that can understand and generate human-like text. Second, we explored the history of GPT, starting with GPT-1 in 2018 and leading to GPT-3 in 2020. Each version brought improvements in size, complexity, and performance. GPT-4 was even more powerful, and is the first model to be widely used in real business situations, even when the stakes are high. Third, we looked at how GPT works under the hood. It predicts the next most likely word in a sentence, which allows it to produce text that feels natural and relevant. But it also has limitations, including hallucinated facts, sensitivity to phrasing, and risk of bias. Finally, we compared different GPT versions and saw how they differ in features, specifically in terms of their ability to handle tasks with few or no examples. We also noted its practical applications, from customer support to creative writing and everything in between. As we move forward in this course, we'll dive deeper into how you can use GPT for professional tasks, daily organization, and creative projects. But for all of that to make sense, it's essential to understand the foundation. So if you've got a solid grasp of what GPT is now, you're off to a great start. Thanks for joining me in this first lesson. In the next session, we'll start exploring how to interact with GPT more effectively using well-crafted prompts. That's where the real power starts to unlock. See you there.